Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, I'm John, this is Many a True Nerd, and this is my little video in preparation for Fallout 4 at E3. And particularly, I think there are a few things that we need to keep an eye out for. I thought we got more information than I was expecting out of the teaser a couple of weeks back, but I think having watched it kind of a few times and put some thought into it, I think actually the teaser leaves us with some fairly big unanswered questions. I just kind of want to kind of discuss what I think are the big unanswered questions, and thus the things I will be paying most attention to during E3 to see if we can kind of tease any new information out of those. So the first is, I think, the flip side of what I originally called as a big pro when I saw the teaser, and I still hold it as a big pro, which is looking at the teaser footage that we've seen already. It's made pretty clear that Bethesda want to make a Fallout-y game for Fallout fans, honouring Fallout stuff. There was that great big montage showing, you know, Brotherhood and super mutants and ghouls and all that Fallout stuff that you're familiar with. It was just kind of a great big list of look, we've put the Fallout stuff in, there's Fallout stuff here, it's Fallout-y, which is fine. I'd rather they did that than the alternative. But in some ways, kind of looking back at it and kind of looking over that trailer, there's a real question of, okay, yeah, you are honouring the Fallout legacy, that's great. What's new? What have you actually added in that's new? Because when we look back kind of historically at the last generation, Fallout 3 didn't have that much new stuff in it. It generally took the established factions and actors and just kind of told a slightly new story, slightly different story with them. So the super mutants were back, but they'd gained a new origin story because they were a different batch of super mutants. And the Brotherhood were there, but their ethos had completely changed because they were a different chapter and things such as that. But generally, Fallout 3 took the established players and just, you know, set them up in a slightly different way. Fallout 3 got maybe a bit of a pass to do that because it changed the mechanics so significantly when it made the change from isometric 2D to kind of the first big open world 3D. So therefore it got a bit of a pass on not introducing too much story or lore-wise that's going to change the Fallout universe forever. Fallout New Vegas realised it couldn't do that because it had been done, so therefore it needed to introduce new stuff. And I'd say, you know, things like Mr. House, brand new, the faction system, Caesar's Legion, who were originally invented to be part of Black Isle's cancelled Fallout 3, became back in New Vegas instead as kind of a brand new faction. Kind of big things that affect our understanding of how the post-apocalyptic West Coast in the Fallout universe has kind of developed and so forth over kind of the centuries after the war. Really kind of big, interesting stuff. And I don't think we really saw any of that so far in the teaser trailer. We don't really know what's new. Probably the most interesting single new thing that we have seen is the airship. So I will be keeping a very, very close eye on those darn airships in whatever footage we get out of E3, specifically because I want to know what impact they're going to have on the world. I mean, does a massive, great flying airship effectively represent a huge flying fortress? Is it like Columbia in Bioshock Infinite? Is it a mechanism by which whichever faction owns it could project a ludicrous amount of force on the ground below? Because if so, that would be a fairly massive, big game changer. So I'll be keeping a very close eye on what it is these airships are actually doing. Because if they're just aesthetic or a method of travel or something, then that'll be quite boring. But if they are actually a very kind of major plot point for like who controls them and what strength or power or influence that gives you, that could be a lot more interesting. The other thing I think we need to look at in terms of new stuff is we need to look back to Fallout 3, which of course gives us our biggest treasure trove of information about what might be going on in Boston and the Institute and the Commonwealth in general. Because I think when they're kind of making Fallout 4, they've got to look back at Fallout 3, Bethesda's own Fallout 3, of course, and come to the conclusion that that is literally pretty much the only canonical source of information we have for what's going on in Boston and the surrounding area at this time. So you've got to think they're going to honour that. And therefore, I'm kind of bring a few things up. This is mainly going to be about the question of the railroad and the Institute, and kind of as a more general conceptual, ideological and philosophical debate about machines versus humans, about does a machine have a soul? Do AIs deserve rights? This was part of the replicated man quest in Fallout 3. So just to remind you of the players, we've got the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, reformed in the Fallout verse post-apocalypse as the Institute, described by Zimmer, who came from there, as a rather fancy little place.
The Commonwealth itself is nothing but a war-ravaged quagmire of violence and despair. Inside the sealed environment of the Institute, however. But the Institute's affairs are none of your concern. Your undeveloped mind couldn't even begin to comprehend what we've accomplished.
Now, Zimmer's biased, of course. He comes from the Institute, but the information he states is backed up by Pinkerton, who's otherwise kind of considered one of the cleverest guys on Rivet City. So when he talks about the Institute...
But there's talk, rumors mostly, about a place called the Institute. That's where Zimmer and that android came from. God knows what else they got going on in there, but it puts our tech to shame, that's for damn sure.
As you can see there, he speaks about it in very glowing terms as well. So I think we can kind of take that as gospel, that the Institute is this bright, shining, glowing monument. I've seen a lot of speculation that the massive, slightly futuristic skyscraper that we've seen in the background as a couple of shots of the teaser footage is probably going to be the futuristic MIT building. So I'd like to think that might be the case. That would be very, very interesting indeed. So the interesting thing about the Institute is they don't come across particularly well in Fallout 3, of course. We hear a story about synthetics being used effectively as slaves, developing consciousness and sentience, and trying to escape from captivity.
It's possible my android sought to forget his previous life.
And indeed, we also hear a story of other synthetics who are tasked with hunting down those that did achieve sentience and try to run away.
I remember it all from before. Zimmer, the Commonwealth, the Institute. My God, all those runners I brought down.
And as part of that struggle, we're introduced to the Railroad, an organisation that gets mentioned in Fallout 3, but so in passing, they're barely even in Fallout 3. But we meet Victoria Watts in Fallout 3, who tells us that the Railroad are a group dedicated to the emancipation of robotic slaves overwhelmingly. They try and help human slaves, but overwhelmingly it's about freeing these androids.
We call ourselves the Railroad. Our mission is the rescue and salvation of synthetic humanoids. Androids, as they're more commonly known.
Now, when you take all those actors and all those kind of moving pieces and all those themes that kind of got briefly touched upon over the course of Fallout 3, these ideas of what is it that makes a man, what is it that makes a living sentient creature, what is it that deserves rights, to what extent should a machine of what level of intelligence be treated with dignity and respect of a living thing. Personally, I would love to see this story play a huge role in Fallout 4. I think it could be very, very interesting indeed, this idea of a huge group of androids who are clearly, and it is implied in the story, that on a regular basis androids do try and escape from captivity, enough that obviously Harkness has been recruited and has regularly taken part in shooting down runners. So androids escaping into the world is a regular occurrence, not irregular at all. So, I don't know, I'd love to think that's going to be a major thing that's introduced, and I think we should definitely be keeping an eye on that.
Every time I retrieved one of the runaway androids, they'd fill my head with ideas about self-determination, freedom. At first, I resisted the ideas, but then I started thinking about it. And well, they were right. We're just slaves to them.
Secondly, I want to discuss the enemies of the game and try and get a feel for who the big bads are, because I don't think we really know that yet at all. Now, we wouldn't necessarily know this yet. I kind of want to point out that obviously we never actually saw the Enclave in the E3 trailer for Fallout 3 back in 2008, was that? Yeah, I think it was 2008. We never saw the Enclave in that trailer. We saw one vertibird, which might have given us a clue, but we never saw the Enclave. But the super mutants did feature quite prominently in the E3 footage, which gave us a bit of an idea of where that was going. So Fallout 4, I don't feel like we actually know who we're fighting yet. I mean, we don't actually know what we're doing full stop at the moment, so that might be a bit ambitious, but it would be nice to know who our kind of main enemies that we're going to be fighting actually are. I suppose a sub-question of that is I want to know how the super mutants fit into this universe. Obviously, we know the super mutants are there, but we don't really know what sort of super mutants they are yet, because obviously super mutants are divided into two very, very specific and different camps. The West Coast super mutants, traditionally seen as the survivors, refugees and so forth from the Master's army, are intelligent, quite articulate, sometimes suffering from various forms of psychological damage, but generally rational, and the prejudice they suffer seen as quite unreasonable versus how reasonable they're willing to be, kind of in its utmost form around Jacobstown in New Vegas perhaps, though the Nightkin that we've kind of seen in other DLC suggests that obviously they can also be unpredictable and difficult to work with, to say the least. Meanwhile, the super mutants that we've seen on the East Coast as introduced in Fallout 3 tend to be a lot dumber, they're much more brutish, they can't really be worked with, they have a tendency towards acts of needless savagery with kind of a high prominence of gore bags and so forth. They're not clever, they're not reasonable, they're engaged in behaviour of basically trying to capture people in order to turn them into super mutants, but it's seen as a dead end because they're literally, you can overhear in Vault 87, that's very easy to miss, that the green goo that they use to the forced evolutionary virus vats, obviously, are running low, and they're having trouble finding any more, so they're a bit of an evolutionary dead end, quite frankly. But that's not to say, obviously, there weren't smart super mutants on the East Coast. There was Forks, of course, and Uncle Leo, though he was just a random encounter, so I don't know what the canonical status of random encounters is in Fallout 3. I've no flipping clue what that would be. But yeah, there's definitely an argument to say that there were smart super mutants in Fallout 3, but also it's questionable whether they can be organised into a reasonable society or not. I guess you could argue that, like in Black Mountain in New Vegas, you saw a somewhat intelligent and somewhat charismatic Nightkin able to rally together a huge number of not desperately intelligent super mutants and form a society of sorts out of them. So yeah, it'll just be interesting to see if we're dealing with super mutants again, are they going to be clever and intelligent and therefore potentially sympathetic, and potentially we can even work with them, or are we dealing with more dumb brutes as per Fallout 3? And finally, and this is perhaps in my mind like the most important question in some ways, which is I want to talk about tone, because core Fallout games, which I define as 1, 2, 3 and New Vegas, they tend to break down into kind of one of two tones. So you either get very lonely, very desolate, very kind of desperate, harrowing experiences, which I think both 1 and 3 kind of match up with, or you get these more kind of faction and town-filled, adventure-y, fun, Kingmaker action games, which I think 2 and New Vegas are very alike in having that tone. And you see it kind of alternates typically, and Bethesda themselves have this habit of developing the more lonely, desolate sort. So it would not surprise me massively if Fallout 4 were to go back towards Fallout 3. But the thing is, we can't really discuss tone in the game without talking about the state of society, because I'd say like how built up and advanced and flourishing societies is very strongly tied to that. The reason why Fallout 1 and 3 I think were so lonely and desperate in their tones were because generally you were dealing with societies that were on the verge of extinction events. These were small, desperate societies just struggling to get themselves set up and survive in the wilderness, and that creates that desperate tone very, very nicely. In Fallout 2 and Fallout New Vegas, you're dealing with factions that are getting on all right. They're building and rebuilding. They're figuring out how to thrive, in fact. You're dealing with factions that are actually starting to get towards performing very, very nicely indeed. And when you're in that environment, you don't feel such a sense of lonely desperation. You can kind of have more kind of fun and adventure because you're effectively helping people who are already doing okay to do even better. And that brings us to the question of Fallout 4, which is a bit interesting, because if we go back to the Fallout 3 information about Boston and the Institute of the Commonwealth, Zimmer says something very, very interesting.
The Commonwealth itself is nothing but a war-ravaged quagmire of violence and despair.
Now again, we should hardly be surprised that Zimmer is being a jerk to everyone around the Institute, given he's clearly very smug on the least and thinks the Institute's fantastic and everything else is rubbish. So he's biased, but again, Pinkerton backs up his position.
Most of it's blasted nothing, just like here.
So we've got confirmation from the two of them again that as far as they're concerned, outside of the enclosure of the Institute itself, we have a situation in Boston where we should expect the environment to be very, very similar to that of Fallout 3, where it's kind of going to be very lonely, very desperate, very desolate. But that really doesn't sync up with what we've seen in the trailer so far, to be honest. We've seen this massive great city that appears to stretch a ridiculously long way. We've seen Boston landmarks standing and looking like they're in pretty good shape. Significant stable populations, advanced technologies, there appears to be large amounts of housing and so forth. The only way I can really reconcile these two positions against each other if both turn out to be true is to say that when we talk about the Institute, I don't know whether the Institute has just eaten most of all that Boston that still stands has just become the Institute city. It is now just the city that is the Institute. Whether there is maybe like a wall, a big wall has been set up around the outside of whatever of Boston is still standing, that has been rebuilt and that is now the Institute. In the same way that there's the massive barricade around the exterior of New Vegas. And all that's within that is, well, I suppose there's Freeside in there as well. But you understand that kind of Vegas itself is within that barricade. Whether potentially everything within a massive walled enclosure around Boston is actually deemed to be the Institute is interesting. I mean, we have seen some desolate, wastelandy environments in the teaser trailer that look a fair bit more like Fallout 3 than we might kind of expect otherwise. So I don't know. I guess that's the best way I can square those two bits of information against each other. That according to Fallout 3, which is really the only canonical Fallout information we have about Boston, the area ought to be a complete desolate wasteland, with the exception of what is under the direct control of the Institute. Yet we have seen a very large city that looks like it's doing pretty well for itself. So my best guess is that the entirety of the occupied, built-up Boston that we've seen is actually under the control of the Institute. And if so, that kind of is very, very interesting, because that brings me back to my first point, which is what's new. And what could be new is the faction of the Institute that is actually the dominant power force in the area. A faction that has the ability to maintain airships, the faction that has the ability to maintain power armor, a very dominant, organised group that actually has significant infrastructure as well as advanced technology, and an entire city backed up with an army that can fly. And that would be interesting. If that's the direction they end up going, and I'll be closely watching to see if there's any flipping signs of that, I will be very, very excited indeed. So there we are, ladies and gentlemen, that was just my thoughts about Fallout 4 in preparation for E3 itself, and just a few points I wanted to raise for what I think we ought to be keeping a very close eye on. Obviously, after Fallout 4's little kind of show off at E3, I'll do another video kind of discussing my thoughts on what we learn about it, and how that feeds into the things that I've previously requested I'd like to see in Fallout 4, and my kind of theories that I've just put forward for you here today. I apologise, there is no episode of Fallout New Vegas You Only Live Once today. Some of you can probably hear in my voice, I'm still recovering from flu at the moment, so I was just about able to make this video, albeit with a lot of sips of water. So unfortunately, I was not quite up for making a full-length New Vegas video today, but I did want to make this video ahead of the E3 presentation itself. So in the meantime, I've been John, this has been Many a True Nerd, and this has been the things that I think we ought to be looking out for for Fallout 4 at E3. Thank you very much, and goodbye.